本期视频是米尔斯海默3月21日参加某播客访谈节目的节选。这位播主是东南亚人，油管粉丝78万。谈话中，他对米尔斯海默赤裸裸的大国政治理论及遏制战略表达了自己的不以为然，场面一度略显尴尬。特别当教授说出零和游戏的字眼时，他终于忍不住笑场。我们一起来看看吧。
I want to switch to China. You know, with everything that we're seeing in Ukraine and West Asia, it just seems, at least to a layman like me, that there's been a misallocation of resource by the United States. You've been making reference in the past about how the United States ought to focus on China, which is the big, call that 6,000-pound gorilla, right? And how do you think we can deter or prevent unintended consequences taking place in, or potentially taking place in, the Taiwan Straits?
Well, let me make two sets of points.
Okay.
First of all, the principal threat that the United States faces in the world is China.
Right.
China is a peer competitor. There are three great powers in the system: the United States, China, and Russia. Russia is the weakest of those three great powers, and China is much more powerful than Russia and is likely to be more powerful than Russia over time. So from an American point of view, China is a peer competitor, Russia isn't. That means that we should focus laser-like on China, and we should do everything we can to pivot to Asia. Pivoting to Asia means pivoting away from Europe and pivoting away from the Middle East. You remember right before the Gaza war broke out on October 7th, right? A few weeks before, Jake Sullivan was crowing about the fact that the Middle East was so stable.
Right.
He said, you know, the Middle East hasn't been this stable in a long time. And of course, that's a wonderful thing for the Americans because we don't want trouble in the Middle East. We want to be able to focus on East Asia, where China is located, obviously, right? But the Middle East is now blown up on us, and we're deeply involved there. Although we're thankfully not doing the fighting, we're nevertheless deeply involved. We're deeply involved in the Ukraine war. And all of this is preventing us from focusing on East Asia and focusing on the China threat. And this is not to our advantage. So we have a deep-seated interest in shutting down both the Gaza conflict and the Ukraine conflict. And of course, that's going to be extremely hard to do. This is to China's advantage. What's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in Ukraine is manna from heaven for the Chinese. The Chinese should actually hope that the war in Ukraine continues, right? And the Americans remain focused on the Ukraine conflict and also remain focused on the Gaza conflict, and therefore don't have time to put together a sufficient containment strategy in East Asia. So this is a real problem for us. I personally think if we were more focused on East Asia, the potential for conflict would be reduced because we would have more military forces in the area, and we would be devoting more of our bandwidth to dealing with the China containment issue rather than Ukraine and rather than Gaza. So I think this is not all for the good that we're distracted. Some people may say that, look, the Chinese are going to see this situation as an opportunity for them to take advantage of the United States.
Would you? Would you see that? Okay.
No, I don't see that. I don't see that for two reasons. First of all, I think the Chinese have a number of problems of their own on the home front, especially with regard to the Chinese economy. I think the last thing Chinese need at this point in time is a conflict with the United States. Just think about that. They have not fought a war since 1979. That's good news in a lot of ways for the Chinese.
Right.
I'm not saying it's too bad they didn't fight more wars.
Yeah.
But They've
more
not
for
fought
peace and commerce.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they've grown economically by leaps and bounds.
Right.
They're now translating that economic might into military might. But they have an army that's not fought a war. The American military has a lot of experience fighting wars. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but the United States
A lot of
is
bad ones too.
Yeah, the United States is like a cocked pistol, right? Chinese military, they haven't fought a war in a long time, and they would have to launch an amphibious operation, which is one of the most difficult military operations possible. They're going to do that in the face of American, Japanese, and Australian resistance.
And the Koreans.
And the South Koreans, in all likelihood, will be there too. So I think that despite the fact that we are deeply involved, too deeply involved, in my opinion, in Gaza and in Ukraine, we're not in that bad a shape in East Asia. Now, the one qualification to that argument is I think the greatest danger is in the South China Sea. I think there you could have a conflict. I think a conflict in the South China Sea is more likely than a conflict in Taiwan. And if you look at what's been happening with regard to the Filipinos and the Chinese over control of small islands, small pieces of territory in the South China Sea, there is real potential for conflict there. And the Americans could get dragged in, because the Americans have a deep-seated interest in rectifying the imbalance of power between China on one hand and the Philippines on the other, so that the Chinese can't take advantage of the Philippines in the South China Sea. So if things begin to heat up between the Chinese and the Philippines, it would, I think, be the case that the Americans would move in to line up or ally themselves with the Filipinos against the Chinese, because the Americans want to make sure that China doesn't dominate the South China Sea.
Despite the fact that there is this discussion and some sort of an agreement to frame this code of conduct, which could come to fruition 2026, give and take, which could be the framework within which any ASEAN state could settle with China. You don't see that as enough of a deterrent, on top of the pre-existing deterrent that you had alluded to earlier in the context of the Taiwan Straits, for China to do anything funny in South China Sea?
Well, a settlement and deterrence are two different issues.
Okay.
I don't think you're going to get a settlement here. It's a zero-sum game. I don't see where there's much room for an agreement here. I mean, hopefully I'm wrong. And I believe the Chinese are hardball players, right? I believe they will.
Well, the South China Sea is a place where probably about 60% of the maritime trade of Japan goes through. 40 to 45% of the maritime trade of China goes through. The vested interest is pretty significant.
Absolutely. That's why we want that body to remain international waters.
As a Southeast Asian, I would try to make an argument that, our history in the last 2,000 years has been filled with our ability to deal with multipolarity in a good way. Also in the context of us with China. There have been some skirmishes, episodically. But the average Southeast Asian probably wouldn't think of, potentially unintended consequences taking place in South China Sea, especially given the fact that we've had discussions on this code of conduct, which would hopefully entail some sort of a framework to settle whatever issues there may be with respect to some of those islands. I don't think there's going to be an unwinding of the reclamation and militarization of these 12 reefs that the Chinese have done. But I think going forward, is it really going to get that bad as you aptly
Let me ask you a question. What do you think the
describe?
Chinese are going to do over time in the South China Sea? Militarily. You think they're going to be content to maintain the status quo? Or do you think they're going to take steps to increase their military presence, their military power in the South China Sea? Just how do you think about that?
Well, if what we have seen in the last few years, in terms of what they have done with those 12 reefs, will go through a linear progression, then it could get worse, right? Intuitively. But I think the onus is also upon us to build our economies in Southeast Asia. And as we build our economies, there's going to be greater degree of agency. There's going to be greater ability to basically say what we need to say to deter or prevent anything funny happening in the South China Sea.
But you don't deter with words.
Well,
It's
if
very
our
important.
economy gets bigger, we can afford equipments, right? So to the extent our economy doesn't get bigger, then we're just going to play with words.
Right. But the point is, you're dealing with a great power here. China is a
Yeah.
great power,
Yeah.
and it's getting more and more powerful, right? I mean, one of the results of all of this economic growth and their development of sophisticated technologies
Yeah.
in the civilian sector is that they're also applying that wealth and those sophisticated technologies to building a quite formidable military capability. They're not there yet by any means. They don't equal the United States, but they're not that far away. And the Chinese are impressive, not to be underestimated. So they're going to have a lot of military power. And I think individually, there's no country in East Asia that can stand up to the Japanese, up to the Chinese, except maybe the Japanese. The Japanese, are quite formidable. But even there, I don't believe they're a match for the Chinese. And I think if you go down into Southeast Asia, there's no country there that, can stand up to all that military might that the Chinese are accumulating. This is the concern. See, my basic view of international politics is that great powers want to grab all of the possible power that is available to them. They want to maximize their power. I think that the Chinese are going to go to great lengths over time to dominate the South China Sea, and not let the Americans continue to make this case that these are international waters and China can't do this and China can't do that. They're going to want to dominate the South China Sea.
The more reason you got to go to Southeast Asia.
Yes.
So that your voice will be heard
Yeah.
by Southeast Asians.